And House Republicans rushed to approve legislation this week that would impose strict new proof of citizenship requirements ahead of the midterm elections.
The bill, called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility or Save America Act, passed 218 to 213. If approved, it would require Americans to prove they are citizens when they register to vote through a valid U.S. passport or birth certificate.
Republicans say the legislation is needed to prevent voter fraud. But some Democrats warn it would disenfranchise millions of Americans by making it harder to vote.
Well, in today's Good Question, Philip asked, would the SAVE Act change how Kentuckians register to vote or cast votes? Here's our Victor Puente with the answer.
The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or the SAVE Act, would not impact Kentuckians when we go to vote, but it would change the process when we register to vote. Kentucky is one of 36 states that require an ID to vote. That would still be in place. The SAVE Act would put new requirements in place to register to vote in federal elections. It also says states must remove non-citizens from their official lists of eligible voters. Right now, when Kentuckians register to vote, you must attest that you are a U.S. citizen when filling out your paperwork. You can do that process online. But under the SAVE Act, people who register would be required to show proof of U.S. citizenship to vote in federal elections. Quote, under any method of voter registration in a state, the state shall not accept and process an application to register to vote in an election for federal office unless the applicant presents documentary proof of United States citizenship with the application. Now, the types of proof they list include real IDs, passports, military IDs, and birth certificates. Now, supporters of the bill say it will strengthen election security, but critics say it's not needed because only U.S. citizens are permitted to vote in federal and state elections. Now, there are no definitive numbers on non-citizens voting in federal elections, but all the research says it's exceedingly rare. A check of the voter rolls in Georgia in 2024 found that of the 8.2 million people registered to vote in that state, 20 were not U.S. citizens. The Bipartisan Policy Center says it also adds hurdles to legitimate voters because roughly 9% of eligible voters do not have easy access to documentary proof of citizenship. They would prefer a check on the back end, where it falls on the government officials to verify if a voter is a citizen. If you have a good question, just email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.